Hello, everybody. Interesting piece in The Atlantic, one of my favorite publications, asking whether spying helped erode American trust. It's by somebody called James Santel. It's a nice piece, and it talks about the stories of the great intelligence icons in American history, everyone from William Colby, who used to run the CIA, to Nathan Hale, who were perhaps the original American spy, to Wild Bill Donovan, who founded the CIA. I think he was the first CIA officer, to William Casey, another guy who ran the CIA. This is all relevant in the context of our conversation today with Jeffrey P. Rogg. His new book, The Spy and the State, The History of American Intelligence, asks the same question. Jeffrey, I'm thrilled he's joining us from Washington, D.C. Where else, even if he's based in Florida? Jeffrey, I hope no one's spying on you.
Oh, I think they always are. Isn't that right, Andrew? These days, at least.
Everybody's watching everyone, Jeff.
That's it.
So this idea that Santel brings up in The Atlantic about spying helping erode American trust. All countries, of course, all states have intelligence agencies, some more effective, some better financed than others. From the foundation, though, of the American Republic, was there always a degree of ambivalence about the idea of intelligence, of spying?
That's right. And particularly with Nathan Hale, it's interesting because he wasn't actually the first person that the officer Knowlton, so George Washington goes to Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Knowlton and says, I need a spy to spy behind enemy lines. And the first person who was offered the job said, I'm not doing that because spying is dishonorable. And one of Nathan Hale's classmates from Yale, William Hull, said the same thing to Hale. Don't do this. Gentlemen, don't spy. A later iteration of that is Henry Stimson's famous declaration, gentlemen don't read each other's mail. So there's a tradition in American history that we're not really comfortable with espionage because it sort of cuts against the grain of what it is to be an American or what we think the best principles of our country is. The problem, though, is like Nathan Hale responded to William Hull, any service in your country's for the service of your country is honorable because it's necessary. And so what I like to say is for most of American history, spying has been considered at best an necessary evil and at worst an unnecessary evil.
Would it be fair to say in the Santel piece, William Casey wasn't keen on the statue, not because of the morality or immorality of Hale, it's because as a spy he failed.
That's right. So Hale wasn't a very good spy. He didn't really use a good cover. He said he was a school teacher. He used his real name. He had the intelligence reports that he had taken on his person. And worst of all, supposedly he revealed his mission to Robert Rogers of the famous Rogers Rangers during the 7 Years' War. And so he didn't have the makings for a good spy because really the same reason that he was willing to spy because of how honorable he was. You know, he famously said his last words were supposedly, I regret that I have but one life to give for my country, made him relatively a bad spy. I would say I took issue with one response in the piece by Santel, which is his read was, well, maybe if Nathan Hale had been a worse American, he would have been a better spy. And that's not necessarily what I mean when I say that spying is un-American. I have friends in the intelligence community, and like I said, when I even ran this idea by them, intelligence, the profession of intelligence, what it requires you to do is antithetical, is un-American. But that doesn't mean the people who do it are un-American.
Yeah, my favorite spy, certainly fictional spy, is a British man called George Smiley, the creation of John le Carré, maybe in some ways autobiographical, although in some ways not.
That's right.
And he's a man of great nobility and decency. Can one, Jeff, be a quote-unquote good moral spy? Is Smiley an invention? Is he a fiction?
Well, you know, I'm going to speak at the Spy Museum later tonight, and my interlocutor is a friend of mine, Nick Reynolds, and he spent many years in the CIA. I know Nick personally. I consider him a very good, dear friend. I think in my experience and with other people that I know who've served in the intelligence community, many of them are incredible Americans, very patriotic. And I want to add, and this is important, extremely concerned about things like civil liberties, constitutional rights, American principles. But again, and this is where they don't necessarily always disagree with me when I say it because they understand what I mean, but the profession of spying itself is un-American. We believe in transparency, in forthrightness. Spying means you sometimes do things that aren't very American in principle. And as we know in American history, at different times, this has included things like, well, surreptitiously trying to affect elections in foreign countries. And so we don't want people to interfere in our elections here, even though it's not only recognized, but has been encouraged at different points in American history to interfere with people's elections overseas.
You seem to be an admirer, though, of successful covert actions. You wrote an interesting piece last year about the Israeli the Israeli project of sending exploding pages to Hezbollah agents. Who are your favorite American spies, and what are your favorite chapters in American spying or covert action?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. So I'm going to actually start with a fictitious spy, and I think it's a fantastic piece of American literature. But the book *The Spy* by James Fenimore Cooper was his second novel. It actually launched him to fame. And in it, there's a fictional character, Harvey Birch, who's based on a real Revolutionary War spy named Enoch Crosby. And the reason why I like this fictional spy is because he's representative of what you had already pointed out, Andrew, which is the ambivalence of American espionage, which is knowing that you're doing something that your fellow Americans might not always appreciate, but doing it in the service of your country. I'd add beyond that, you already mentioned one of them. So Bill Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan, he was not a CIA officer.
Yeah, and what a name. I mean, God,
Bill.
He must have, to be called Wild Bill Donovan, I think all boys would love to be grown up to be described as Wild Bill, especially if they ran the CIA.
Well, and so he didn't actually run the CIA. He ran there were two forebears for it, the Office of the Coordinator of Information and then the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. He never got to run the CIA, and one of the reasons why, and this goes to ambivalence, is Donovan was an innovator. He was a disruptor. He wasn't a very good manager. And he also created a lot of political enemies in the process of trying to create what eventually became the CIA. He was advocating for a post-war Central Intelligence Organization. But what's remarkable about Donovan is, first of all, his personal bravery. He was the only American to win the 3 highest awards for valor in the First World War. And secondly, he was someone that we needed at that time, because at the time, intelligence wasn't an independent profession of national security. You had military intelligence officers, you had FBI special agents who did intelligence missions, you had State Department pseudo-diplomats who moonlighted as spies, but you didn't have a distinct intelligence profession. And one of the things that Donovan and other OSS officers realized is there's something different about intelligence. It requires special training, a special type of character. And so one of the things that I admire about Donovan is he disrupted an entire pattern of American history in which we subordinated the intelligence profession. And so the creation of the CIA was important because it heralded the creation of an independent American intelligence profession.
Yeah, and please correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding of Donovan and the setting up of the OSS and then the CIA is it was done in opposition, certainly, to J. Edgar Hoover and his role at the FBI. And in some ways, Donovan, with his heroism, his lack of management skills, his iconoclastic nature, is the reverse of J. Edgar. Is that fair?
That's a great read, Andrew. And they're really, it's parallel lives almost. So J. Edgar Hoover, bureaucrat, worked his way up, by the book, except when it came to domestic spying, which he wasn't really supposed to do, but couldn't help himself. He was always worried about communist and socialist subversion. The other interesting thing that I point out in the book is Hoover was always inward looking. In other words, he wanted what was first the BOI, the Bureau of Investigation. In 1935, it becomes the FBI. He was always more concerned about communist, subversive, anarchists at home in the United States. And what happens over the course of the 1930s is, of course, with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he asked Hoover to look out for fascists and communists in 1936 in the United States. But as we know, as the 30s moved towards the 40s, you need to look outward because we have the onset of war with Japan and Germany. And so Donovan was the right man at the right place at the right time, because Donovan had been outward looking during this time period. He was very popular. He was a Wall Street millionaire, a war hero, and he had powerful friends. And so when FDR needed foreign intelligence, Hoover wasn't the person to give it to him. And there's a debate about how interested FDR was in intelligence. I'm going to have this debate maybe tonight with my buddy Nick. But FDR did something, along with Donovan being a disruptor, did something dramatic, because he appoints Donovan to be, again, this coordinator of information. And the idea is we need to coordinate the the U.S. intelligence community as it existed at the time. It wasn't coordinated, and it wasn't done for the president of the United States. So again, FDR and Donovan, and they had an interesting dynamic. Their relationship sort of fades over the course of the Second World War, maybe as Donovan's star rises. But they were disruptive to the American intelligence tradition. And so this is a watershed moment in American intelligence history.
J. Edgar, of course, had his own secrets, which are still incredibly controversial. I read, I don't know, a 900-page biography of him, which seems to make it clear that he was a homosexual who didn't always tell the truth about his private life. What about Donovan and the kind of people he recruited to the CIA or the OSS? Were they more swashbuckling types than a closet homosexual like J. Edgar Hoover?
So that's a fantastic question, too. There was actually a great article.
It's probably an unfair one. I'm sure I will piss people off by asking it such a vulgar question.
No, it's a good question, though, because it's a timely question. So there was a great article in the New York Times today that talked about the diversity of the OSS. So Donovan was, he wanted intelligence officers to do well regardless of where they came from in life. I mean, he's from Buffalo, New York, Irish guy, self-made man. And so he recruited people who came from different backgrounds. And so the article, in the New York Times points out that included homosexuals. Also, though, and this was important for a reason that Hoover hated, he also had communist sympathizers in his ranks. And the danger there was that some of them actually worked for the Soviets. One of them, Duncan Lee, was Donovan's personal assistant and ended up being a Soviet spy. And so Hoover, again, being paranoid about socialists and communists, really didn't like that about the OSS, is that they had communist subversives in the ranks. Donovan's feeling was, we're going after Hitler and we need good people. It doesn't matter where they come from. And so what was interesting is his willingness to tolerate that risk of a counterintelligence failure. And, again, great risk, great reward. That actually made it so that the OSS wasn't very popular outside of its own ranks, because other branches of government or other intelligence organizations in the U.S. government, other executive departments saw Donovan as a threat. They saw the OSS as a threat. And one more point on the diversity of the OSS was there was also a fascinating difference in that the OSS performed what you could arguably say are conflicting intelligence functions. They did analysis. They also did propaganda. They did operations, and within operations, they did both espionage and then covert action and paramilitary operations. And the culture of each of these types of intelligence functions is different. And so there were built-in conflicts within the OSS itself. And so Donovan is one of the reasons why, because he wanted a one-stop shop for all things intelligence.
You talk about diversity, but when you look at Bill Donovan and Nathan Hale and William Colby and William Casey, I mean, one thing is particularly striking. They're all white men. I assume, I haven't actually seen the Times piece you refer to, but I assume that these days the agency is much more diverse.
Yes. So one thing that's difficult, and I say this, in the book about American history and American intelligence history, is you have to face it, the intelligence community has only been as representative as any other element of the US government for most of the history, which means as racially, ethnically, religiously diverse as the US government, which at different points in history is to say not very diverse. So I was speaking at the Yale Club last night, and I was talking about famous Yaleys who became spies.
Right, there were some women. The Yale Club are allowing women into their audience these days, Jeff.
They certainly are. As of the late '60s, and one of the reasons why there was this, I mentioned this Yale/CIA officer named Charles Tracy Barnes, and when he was fired from the CIA, he was involved in planning the Bay of Pigs. He went to work for Kingman Brewster, who was the president of Yale at the time, and one of the initiatives he worked on was actually equal education for women, and he worked on racial tensions within Yale. Now, this is an interesting bookend to Nathan Hale, because Nathan Hale had been a member of the Linonian Society, and this is, remember, in the 1770s, when he argued against slavery and in favor of equal opportunities for women for education at Yale. So Hale and Barnes are interesting bookends, but the larger point is even in my presentation last night, one of the claims about the CIA historically is that it's been pale, male, and Yale. And that's been somewhat true. However, the intelligence community is certainly more diverse today. Some of the numbers that I looked at in terms of demographics of the agency in the 90s and in the 2000s was that it still was not as demographically diverse as other elements of the US government. I think that's changed in recent years. But I do encourage your listeners to also read this article, because the point is especially when it comes to espionage, certain people will fit into different environments and understand different cultural environments better than others. And so, as this article concludes, and I can't disagree, when it comes to intelligence, diversity isn't necessarily only a strength. Sometimes it's a requirement for the job.
You mentioned the Bay of Pigs, which must be one of the darker chapters. I know you note that in the book, in American intelligence history. What are the other more troubling chapters? Bay of Pigs was an example of a completely failed mission, wasn't it?
Yes. And, so one of the problems with covert action, and it's kind of like the siren song, is you're promising policymakers that you can accomplish a foreign policy goal sort of on the cheap and without having to claim responsibility. The US didn't do this. That's risky. And especially when it involves something like an undeclared invasion of a foreign country using your own proxy forces. So basically, there's sort of a ladder of covert action, and the more aggressive or violent it is, the harder it is to hide. And so Bay of Pigs is one example of that. In terms of darker chapters, though, and I will say in that article in The Atlantic, the author Santel, he didn't think that, I guess, myself and Mark Lowenthal condemned the CIA enough for its involvement in
that's
assassination plots.
That's standard from The Atlantic. Don't worry about that. Don't take that person.
Well, and he perhaps wants a stronger condemnation. I also say, well, let's talk about what policymakers and the American people wanted at the time, because they wanted to be safe from communism as well. So careful what you wish for as a country is one of my warnings in the book. But, there were other dark chapters in American history. One that he misses also, because he sort of glides very quickly from Nathan Hale to the Cold War, is in the turn of the 20th century, newspaper headlines around the country reported that the Secret Service had been spying on members of Congress for the Teddy Roosevelt administration, looking for corruption. Now, this had happened at other points in American history. Alan Pinkerton, the famous Civil War detective, allegedly spied on Abraham Lincoln on behalf of George McClellan, who became Lincoln's political opponent in 1864. So something that I'm always careful of, or alarms me, is when we use intelligence domestically and involve it in our own politics. So those, to me, and it's happened frequently in American history, so those are dark chapters. And then there's some better known ones too, aside from the Bay of Pigs, where during the Cold War, the CIA was involved in, they called it mind control experiments, Project MK Ultra, but really it was things like resistance to interrogation, because we got our POWs back from Korea and we were worried about how do you interrogate people or how do we make our personnel more robust. And then more recently, of course, as we know with the Snowden revelations, is mass surveillance of American citizens. And that, by the way, is something that really tends to bother Americans when we find out that our own country was spying on us.
Yeah, and when it comes to darker moments, you mentioned Roosevelt. What about this remarkable story? And again, correct me if I'm wrong, where I don't know if it was Bill Donovan, or certainly a senior CIA officer sent, I think it was the nephew of FDR, was it Kermit Roosevelt, to Iran to orchestrate a coup, which I think he was successful in, but it's certainly another dark moment. But in a way, it also is an example of the sort of romantic ideal of an individual heroic figure like Roosevelt actually managing to change world history.
So that was Kermit Kim Roosevelt Jr., a grandson of Teddy Roosevelt. And the project, Project Ajax, which was the coup against Mohammad Mossadegh, the elected leader of Iran at the time.
Which we don't approve of course. That seems to be the foundations of all the subsequent woes in Iranian history.
And they still blame us to this day. So that's why we have to be careful.
Understandably, right?
Understandably. I mean, look, we don't like it when other countries are involved in our politics. So it is understandable. Of course, at the time, and I think there was misplaced analysis, because the concern among both the Brits and the Americans, aside from, the oil interest nationalizing Iranian oil, was that Mossadegh was a communist sympathizer, and there really isn't evidence of that, or was sympathetic with the Tudeh party in Iran, the pro-communist party. The other issue that I find fascinating with history is, so the CIA writes an internal report in the spring of 1954, and they use this term that we have subsequently adopted in intelligence studies, blowback. And blowback means the unintended consequences of covert action. So, they're worried about the blowback from the overthrow of Iran. Now, a couple months later, the CIA is involved, and this is Charles Tracy Barnes again, in the coup in Guatemala in 1954. And so, it's how quickly do you learn the lessons of history? In that case, I guess we just went from one coup to another coup. And the other thing that I think we have to be careful of is, notice you and I, Andrew, are hitting the high note, or I should say the low notes in American intelligence history, but we have to be careful about only judging the intelligence community by those lows.
We certainly do. And would it be fair to say, in defense of the agency or American spying, that it never had a Philby Burgess chapter of the entire agency, essentially senior people being riddled with Soviet or enemy spies?
Well, we unfortunately, what we did have, and it was both the CIA and the FBI, and each of them. I don't know if you've seen that famous meme of like Spider-Mans all pointing at each other. Your viewers might watch it online, but there's like
I think
Spider-Mans pointing at each other. So there was actually concurrent spies, Soviet moles in the CIA and the FBI.
Ames, for example, we did a show on Ames. He was an FBI agent, wasn't he?
Ames was CIA. Aldrich
Ames. Ames was CIA.
Robert Hansen was FBI.
Right.
And so they were concurrent. They overlap slightly. I believe Ames preceded Hansen, and Hansen made it a little bit longer before he was caught. But again, when it comes to CIA-FBI rivalry, each of them accused the other of having a spy in their ranks. And guess what? They were both right. So we didn't have the highest levels of government, but what was dangerous is both Ames and Hansen were counterintelligence officers. And counterintelligence officers are the ones who are supposed to stop foreign spies, and they get the keys to the kingdom. So they can be the most dangerous spies to have. And so unfortunately, we have had spies, and even during Nathan Hale's time, another famous one, a traitor, Benedict Arnold. Not necessarily a spy, but a traitor. And so, that's part of America. That's part of history, is you are going to be compromised at different points in time. The game never ends. And we are trying to compromise rival intelligence officers in other countries as well.
You mentioned gender. J. Edgar Hoover, of course, was very suspicious of Black America, of Martin Luther King in particular. He seemed to be obsessed with finding out spying on him. What about the history of race and the intelligence agencies? When did the CIA, for example, begin to employ Black people?
Oh, from the very beginning, and the OSS did as well. You know, so in the book I mentioned this, but we had spies even famously during the American Revolution. James Armistead Lafayette, African American spy, double agent, actually pretended to spy for the British. He really spied for the Americans. And Hercules Mulligan, who Casey preferred to Nathan Hale, had a African American slave named Cato who also spied for the Americans as well. And so that's been true throughout American history. What concerns me more when I read the history, and I found a fascinating quote about this, is what we tend to do during periods of heightened spy mania is we tend to, the intelligence community, especially surveil whether it's religious, ethnic, racial, political minorities. And so I found a quote from an early history of the United States, turn of the 20th century, where it said, each period of American history, the Tories, who were the pro-Brits during the American Revolution, become the Copperheads, who are the pro-Confederacy Democrats in the North during the Civil War. They become the Catholics and the Spanish during the Spanish-American War, and then they become the Germans and the Socialists during the First World War. And you can continue that. And what I mean by it is during different periods of crisis in the United States, we look at where the crisis is originating, and then we tend to project that onto our fellow Americans from that background. And so, again, this is where it's not always only the intelligence community that's doing this. It's the American people themselves. And I have the evidence because even going back to the American Revolution, moving forward, War of 1812, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, I have letters written by Americans where they're reporting their fellow Americans and accusing them of being spies. And so this is where I think we need to be careful during crises of becoming giving our intelligence community these really sweeping mandates that then it's very hard to walk back after you give them and empower the intelligence community. After the crisis is over, it's hard to walk it back. And so that cyclical pattern in American history where we encourage the intelligence community to go too far, and then after it's over, we say, well, why'd you go too far? And the intelligence community says, well, you asked us to. It keeps happening, and it's never good for the intelligence community, the government, or the rest of the country.
You wrote a piece back in March for the Wall Street Journal about the signal crisis, or what some people call signal gate, and the future of national security. How much does this tell us about the broader challenges and problems with contemporary American intelligence, or was it really just a one-off example of general incompetence and irresponsibility?
Well, that's the issue is, more and more people were saying both administrations have at different points in time been irresponsible with national security secrets or going about protecting them. And to me, one of the points in writing that piece, though, was that was the easy criticism. What I was focused on more, it was instead, we need to develop, intelligence needs to keep pace with civil society. And I say that because I'm an educator and I teach younger students. And having worked in a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility myself, as briefly as it was, that's not going to be the quality of life that young Americans want going into the intelligence community. So my larger point in the piece is now these were political appointees who were doing this, but our intelligence community, our national security establishment, technologically needs to keep pace with advancing technology. During COVID, America's intelligence officers couldn't work from home. That's problematic, though, because we also had social distancing and quarantines. And so it's not workable any longer to expect this, as a colleague of mine, Michael Ard, said, a brick and mortar approach to a classification system. We need to keep pace with the times. And so what I was encouraging in the Signalgate scandal is, yes, we can all criticize the individuals involved, and we have to be careful about was it classified information or not? But at the same time, what are the lessons learned going to be? And one of the lessons learned, again, that I would encourage the intelligence community, it should have looked at it during COVID, is are we keeping pace with current technology? And I think the answer is that the government doesn't keep up with the private sector anymore. And so there's a trade-off between technology and speed and convenience and security. And it's not about absolutely accomplishing one or the other, keep pace with technology, or stay totally secure. It's about finding a balancing act between the two that we just haven't really found.
Very reasonable. You're a professor at the University of South Florida, so you turn all crises, I think, Jeff, like a good academic, into a learning education experience. Let's end by fast forwarding to today's intelligence community. John Ratcliffe is the director of the CIA, and of course, Kash Patel is running the FBI. They both reflect a general hysteria, perhaps, and even a suspicion, a lack of trust of the security services. Is this business as normal in Washington, D.C.? You're talking to me from Washington, D.C. these days, Jeff, or has something changed with Trump 2.0? Is this the first time that a presidential administration has turned on its own intelligence community?
No, it's not. Different presidents have been more and less suspicious of intelligence, or more and less engaged with intelligence. I mentioned FDR, who was quite involved in intelligence. He had multiple people collecting intelligence from multiple sources.
Typical FDR, and I'm guessing Nixon was also paranoid about it.
Nixon and Kissinger, and it wasn't only paranoia, it was also a sense of, we can do their job better than them. Just give us the raw information and we'll make the analytical judgments and the foreign policy calls. The other thing, though, and it's good you mentioned Nixon. So when he appoints James Schlesinger as the director of the CIA, and Carter did the same thing with Stansfield Turner, at different points in time, the political leadership of the country have appointed intelligence officials to sort of try and clean up or reform the intelligence community. And one of the things that you find is outside appointees given a mandate to sort of either be axemen or reformists in the insular intelligence community tend not to do that well. This is where you have this, and I would say, I use the term carefully because it's not entirely true, but this is where the fear of the deep state comes in. Because when there's a sense that your own intelligence community is rebelling against the elected leadership, and when there's a sense that the elected leadership is in opposition to your own intelligence community, it's created a very toxic environment for civil intelligence relations. We've all seen this. The support for the intelligence community has become polarized along political lines. And one of the things that you see with the appointees is, unlike the first Trump administration, where the appointees, for instance, Gina Haspel, came from the CIA, now you're appointing people from outside the intelligence services, so Tulsi Gabbard, for instance, as well, Ratcliffe, Kash Patel. And the idea is to keep an eye on it or reform it. And, the concern is, again, is this creating unnecessary political polarization? And that's what the polls tend to reflect. And so for me, one thing that I can say on the strength of 250 years of American intelligence history is, regardless of who's doing the politicization, whether it's coming from inside the intelligence community or coming from the elected leadership, it doesn't serve anyone well.
And so I'm guessing, Jeff, and it's hard to tell on this, but I don't know that much about Radcliffe. He's very much of a Trump loyalist, but I'm guessing once he ends up as the front man at the CIA, where the buck stops with him, he will be, so to speak, infected with agency values. So once you get into these large intelligence bureaucracies, however hostile or critical or suspicious you are in the first place, you're probably transformed into one of them.
In some respects, that sometimes tends to be the case. Leon Panetta, who came from outside the IC to the CIA, was popular with the CIA. And so, there's a saying when we teach this, when I worked as a postdoc at the Naval War College and taught, what we told students was, where you stand depends on where you sit. And so, yes, it can be the case that political appointees enter office thinking that they're going to be the reformers, and instead, the organization that they bureaucratically represent in government changes them and they become its defender. But that also is very individual based, personality based. And so, it's going to be hard to say with Ratcliffe. And then the question is if is the person so unpopular on the inside that they're ineffective, or does the political leadership, the Trump administration, if they don't like the results they're seeing from the organization, do they move on and appoint someone else? And so, the great thing about intelligence is it's fascinating. It's in the news every day. When it comes to American intelligence, we always find a conspiracy, a controversy, a scandal. And so, the I guess the more intelligence is in the news, the better my job is. But I will say, and I think this is again important, is at any one point in time in American history, we have the intelligence community that we've bargained for. So for good or for bad, for better or for worse, I do think that the intelligence community reflects the strengths and weaknesses of American civil society and the U.S. government as a whole.
We get what we deserve, and perhaps we get what we deserve with you, Jeff. You speak with great fluency about this, and your new book, The Spy and the State, A History of American Intelligence, tells an important story. Although you yourself are somewhat ambivalent, it would seem, about intelligence. On your X page, you quote the great French revolutionary Georges Danton, who famously said, "Better to be a poor fisherman than to meddle with the government of men." So are you suggesting that you yourself wouldn't have been much of an intelligence officer? There's not a lot of wild Jeff Rogg, like Wild Bill Donovan, that you're better off writing about it than participating?
So personal biography, one of the things I did was I enlisted in the military after law school, and I had nurtured ideas. I went to a special selection course and I got hurt in the training, and I met some fantastic friends who I'm still in touch with today. I'll see some of them tonight, and they've gone on to do some very extraordinary things in the service of the country and national security. And so for myself, though, and we talk about this especially as we get older, I grew up in Tampa, Florida. I grew up fishing. It's important to remember.
So you'd rather be so the Danton quote is more about fishermen than
it's a little bit, but it's also part of the you learn over time, and I see this reflected in my friends and some of the personal histories when you read about intelligence officers, and this applies outside intelligence too, to military service, government service in general. The government, you work in the service of a country, you have to know the game you're in, and one day that career might be over one way or another, and what kind of life do you have? Or also live by the sword, die by the sword. We've seen intelligence officers who've gotten burned by their own country, who feel very disaffected. And so I think what I am getting at in the quote is, it's kind of like Voltaire too. We must cultivate our own garden. Just remember where you came from. Remember that it's a job. I know there's a lot invested in it personally, but at the end of the day, it's what you do. It's not who you are. And so who I am is a guy who loves to fish when I get every chance I can. So hopefully this weekend too.
Well, that's an important new book and very important subject. The Spy and the State, the history. It's not a history. It's the history of American intelligence. Won't be the last thing, of course, written about intelligence. But congratulations, Jeff, on the book. And as the Trump administration unfolds, so to speak, I'm sure there will be many more crises and scandals in intelligence. We'll have to get you back on the show. Thank you so much.